Uh, Thank you all very much. It really is a joy to be here. I've lived in New England for much of my life, and I have to confess this is my first visit to St. Anselm, so I'm honestly thrilled to be here. I want to thank my good friend Peter Josephson and Ann as well from the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, and thank you also to Brendan for that nice introduction. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about George Washington, the man I believe was the indispensable president. I don't see the presidency, I don't see the American Constitution, first of all, being ratified, and then secondly, being implemented without Washington's incredible presence. And by the way, let me just say, since we're approaching President's Day, I really wish we would get rid of the idea of President's Day and go back to honoring both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, who I believe are standouts on that list of presidents. I'm not sure, with all due respect to Millard Fillmore or Chester Alan Arthur, that these men deserve to be commemorated. But to the point here, George Washington and his indispensable presidency. Let me start by noting that Washington was inaugurated in New York City on April 30th, 1789. And he took the helm of an executive branch with a mandate to execute and define the nebulous powers of the president granted in Article 2 of the Constitution. There was a lot of vague, if you look at Article 2 in the Constitution, there's a lot of vague and ambiguous language there that Washington had to sort of flesh out. And Washington understood that the precedents he set would shape the American presidency and the nation for as long as the American experiment survived. Writing to a British historian less than a year after assuming his office, Washington noted, quote, "I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent," end quote. Washington's inaugural ceremony took place at approximately 2 p.m. on April 30th on the second floor of Federal Hall in downtown Manhattan. And interestingly enough, George Washington was very nervous taking his oath from Chancellor Robert Livingston. Washington was overcome with emotion upon completing his oath and had a difficult time reading his inaugural address. This is based on contemporaneous newspapers' accounts. And while some of the emotion was the result of his understanding the historical importance of the occasion, the president also approached this new, uncharted assignment with a sense of dread. He wrote his old wartime ally, Henry Knox, that his elevation to the presidency was, quote, accompanied with feelings not unlike those of a culprit who was going to his place of execution. The new president had little to guide him, as I mentioned, although along with most prominent Americans, he had read the series of essays that became known as the Federalist Papers. Washington believed that those essays shed new light upon the science of government, as he put it, and were likely to make a lasting impression on those who read Publius's, the pen name of the Federalist Papers authors, clear and forcible arguments. It's likely that Washington found some guidance in these essays, as two of the authors, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, were his political allies, at least at the time, and the third author, John Jay, had drafted the Constitution for the state of New York, which had created a strong chief executive. Hamilton, of course, was the primary author of the essays dealing with the presidency, and while he would never hold the office of president, his influence on President Washington and on the long-term health of the office of the presidency was significant. One of the major concerns of the incoming president was the ability of the United States, this new, young, untested nation, to coherently conduct war and foreign affairs. Washington had seen up close and personal the near disastrous results of conducting war by committee during the American Revolution. The nation's first president would set innumerable precedents that would be cited by his successors to justify presidential leadership in matters of war and national security. And Washington's distaste for conducting war and foreign policy by committee was evident in his failed attempt in the first few months of his presidency to solicit the United States Senate's advice on treaty negotiations with the Creek Indians. The new president believed that the Constitution mandate that he share this negotiating responsibility with the Senate. And so Washington met in person with the entire Senate. And as Washington looked on, members of the Senate pontificated for hours on end and then deferred action on a proposed treaty, leaving Washington, as he put it, in a violent fret and grousing that this tendency of the senators to sort of drift off and discuss non-related matters defeated every purpose of his coming to the Senate. Washington had genuinely sought the advice of the upper chamber, but he quickly abandoned the practice after this dismal experience. And every American president since Washington has pretty well left, with a few exceptions, left the Senate aside when they've been negotiating treaties with foreign powers and simply gone back to the Senate to win their consent, but no advice responsibility. Washington went on to shape so many aspects of the presidency that we take for granted today. He created the president's cabinet, and his first appointee was Alexander Hamilton, age 34, now a Broadway celebrity, for the position of Secretary of the Treasury. Joining Hamilton in the cabinet were Washington's faithful subordinate from the war, General Henry Knox, whom I previously mentioned, and for a time, John Jay, who was the de facto Secretary of State until Thomas Jefferson returned from France in March 1790. Rounding out the cabinet was the president's lawyer, Edmund Randolph of Virginia, serving as Attorney General. Now, it took some time for the idea of a cabinet to take hold. In fact, Washington did not convene his first cabinet meeting until February 25th, 1793, so that's late into his first term. And he did not use the term cabinet in any written correspondence until April of 1793. But Washington took care to ensure that his cabinet was geographically balanced so that no region of the nation would feel slighted. In addition to appointing high-ranking cabinet officials, Washington also appointed members of the federal judiciary and close to 1,000 lesser offices within the entire federal government, including customs officials, postal officials, lighthouse tenders, and other federal government-related duties. And he ensured that only those Americans who were of, quote, a known attachment to the new Constitution received these posts. In other words, it was highly unlikely if you were an anti-federalist opposed to the ratification of the Constitution that you were given one of these offices. I believe there were a few exceptions to that, but generally speaking, you had to have been a supporter of the Constitution. Washington personally supervised the selection of these officials, focusing on their integrity and character rather than on any subject matter expertise, although prior public service was generally seen as a plus. All of Washington's steps in terms of staffing this new federal government was designed to bind the American citizens to the idea of a United States government and to a nation rather than a locality, or in particular, a state. Washington sought, as president, to convince his fellow Americans, as Hamilton had put it in a letter to Washington once, of the virtues of men who think continentally. Think continentally. All of this at a time when most Americans seldom journeyed beyond the confines of their birthplace. As an immigrant, Hamilton never considered himself a citizen of a particular state. He was an American. Washington, however, had felt a strong bond towards his native Virginia, and considered himself a Virginian. And his transformation from, arguably, a parochial Virginian to a champion of American nationalism is one of the more dramatic fashions of this man's dramatic life. Washington was determined that his fellow citizens follow the same path. Now, part of this effort to convince his fellow citizens to think continentally involved the seemingly innocuous issuance of a Thanksgiving proclamation in October 1789. Many members of Congress assumed that this proclamation would be issued by the various state governors, but Washington, sensing an opportunity to bind the citizens to the new national government and to the presidency, issued the proclamation himself. The proclamation was filled with references to the new nation and was addressed to the people of the United States, not to the states. In addition to taking steps to ensure that Americans thought continentally and thought of themselves as one people, Washington left the American presidency in a strong position within the federal government. He breathed life into the veto power, and in concert with Congressman James Madison, he set the precedent that the president alone possessed the power to remove executive branch appointees. By the way, this was not clear. If you look at the language of the Constitution, since the Senate played a role in confirming a number of executive branch officials, then the argument was made that they should play a role in the removal of these officials. And Washington at first seems to have accepted that notion. Madison, probably with some influence from Hamilton, eventually convinced Washington that this, in fact, was an executive prerogative, the ability to fire an executive branch official. So this comes to a head in Congress in 1789. It's called the removal debate. And I would argue that this removal debate stands as one of the most momentous in terms of presidential power. And without Washington's presence, without his ability to put his weight, his influence behind the idea that the president alone possessed the power to remove executive branch officials, we could have very easily gone in the different direction. And that's important because it would have meant that the United States government would have resembled far more of a parliamentary system, where members of the legislative branch played a role in the removal, not just the appointment of, but also the removal of executive branch officials. As historian Gordon Wood has noted, had Washington failed to carry the day, the United States, as I mentioned, would have moved dramatically in the direction of a parliamentary system. Madison corralled the votes needed in the House to sustain the president's removal power, but many members of the Senate balked. But ultimately, a divided Senate, due to, again, Washington's influence, Washington's prestige, sided with the president. Now, regarding the veto power, interestingly, George Washington at first seemed hesitant to exercise it. Nevertheless, he was the first president, perhaps for obvious reasons, to cast vetoes in the history of the presidency, issuing 2 vetoes through his 8 years in office, one in his first term, one in the second term. Washington's first term veto involved the question of congressional reapportionment, which Secretary of State Jefferson had strongly urged the president to reject on constitutional grounds. Jefferson also urged the president to veto the bill on the grounds that, quote, non-use of this negative power already begins to excite a belief that no president will ever venture to use it. And so there was this desire to sort of lay down a marker that the president, in fact, did possess this power and would rebuff any congressional inroads on his authority. So that first veto was done on constitutional grounds. The second veto that Washington cast, though, was done on policy grounds. It was a policy dispute between the president and the Congress. The bill that had passed in March 1797, the veto, that Washington cast in March 1797, struck down a bill that would have reduced the size of the American army. And Washington vetoed it on grounds that this was a danger to American national security. And the House of Representatives was unable to override his veto. I mention this to you because there's this popular misconception out there that President Andrew Jackson was the first president to cast a veto on policy grounds. It's not true. That honor, in fact, belongs to George Washington. Washington set other precedents as well and left a legacy of respect for the new office through his deft blend of accountability and detachment. His frequent presidential tours of the nation, including of New Hampshire, allowed the people to see their president, although always at a distance. This was not a glad-handing president who pandered to the people and tried to win their affection by presenting himself as a regular guy. Now, that's very much a 20th century phenomenon. Washington believed that the people wanted to look up to their president and that a certain amount of awe toward the office, even in a republic, was an attribute that contributed to respectable government. A visit from President Washington was the biggest event to happen in some remote American towns, even to this day. I know in my home state of Massachusetts, some of these towns still have these large plaques commemorating Washington's visit. Nothing has happened since that day, so I shouldn't say that. Traveling over nearly impassable roads in a resplendent coach with 6 white horses drawing it along, the president would inevitably be greeted by a welcoming committee of the respectable citizens of the town, and he would utter a few inconsequential pieties about the destiny of the new republic. All of this served to bind the nation together. And this is an important point. This was a nation in which the citizens of South Carolina had about as much in common with the citizens of New Hampshire as they did with residents of Tasmania. And Washington hoped to garner respect for the office of the chief executive as well. Washington's tours had the added benefit of clarifying the relationship between the states and the federal government, another relationship that was left somewhat ambiguous under the new Constitution. Washington's first presidential tour, in fact, was of New England, although Washington pointedly excluded Rhode Island, which had failed to ratify the Constitution. He made a point of sort of going right around the edge of Rhode Island at one point just to rub it in. He received a somewhat chilly reception from the governor of Massachusetts, the pompous John Hancock. The latter would be merely a footnote in American history were it not for the presence of his oversized signature on the Declaration of Independence. That's my own little editorializing there. Hancock believed that as governor of the Bay State, he outranked Washington on Massachusetts soil. And it was up to Washington to pay a courtesy call on him rather than the other way around. Feigning gout, Hancock made it clear that he would not greet the president upon his arrival in Boston, but he left open the door for the president to visit him. After seeing the tumultuous reception that Washington received in Boston, Hancock suddenly recovered from his case of gout, strategically applied some bandages, and went out and managed to greet the president. Now, again, this seems like a little minor episode of protocol and logistics, but it was important for its symbolic meaning of the presidency, the place of the presidency in the new American experiment. Now, Washington, whose life was characterized by repeated examples of magnanimity, accepted Hancock's cover story with grace, knowing full well that this was one more small victory on the path of getting Americans to look beyond the parochial. Washington was greeted, as he noted in his diary, quote, by a vast concourse of people who accepted the legitimacy of the new Constitution and the authority of that most controversial office, the American presidency. Now, I believe that Washington's presidency offers us a few lessons well, actually many lessons for today. I'll mention a few. During Washington's first year as the nation's president, he observed that his greatest fear was that, quote, the nation would not be sufficiently cool and moderate in making arrangements for the security of liberty. In other words, he feared that there would be a tendency on the part, perhaps, of, for lack of a better term, the common man, to trample on the rights of unpopular minorities. Now, Washington's commitment to reason, and most importantly, perhaps moderation, began when he was a teenager, when he had copied by hand over 100 rules of civility. Some of you may have seen these, including the following passage, quote, let your conversation be without malice or envy, and in all causes of passion, admit reason to govern. So Washington's entire public career was devoted to this notion of having reason govern the passions. And in 1787, while contemplating whether to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Washington noted again in a letter to his good friend Henry Knox that one of the failings of democracy was, quote, that the people must feel before they will see, end quote. Feelings, passions, emotions motivate political action, Washington believed, not appeals to reason, and this presented a problem for a republic. As such, both as a general and as a president, Washington was a firm proponent of the rule of law. For instance, in the early days of and I realize here I'm going outside of his presidency, but it'll all come together in the end here. For instance, in the early days of the American Revolution, less than a week after the Declaration of Independence had been signed and promulgated, Washington condemned the mob which had pulled down the statue of King George III in downtown Manhattan on July 9th, 1776. Some of you may have seen the famous illustration of that equestrian statue being toppled by a mob. Eventually it was melted down into bullets for the Continental Army. But Washington was not pleased with what he saw as a kind of mob action. And some of his soldiers had participated in that riot, if you will. And he issued strict orders to his men that no longer were they to participate in these kinds of public displays of lawlessness. Again, here he is leading the military effort against George III, but he's also trying to lay down a marker in favor of the rule of law and in opposition to mob action. So Washington's public service was bookended by these pleas for moderation. He begins with that story I just told you, within days of the Declaration of Independence being issued, urging restraint and obedience to the rule of law. And he ends on the same note in his farewell address as President of the United States, which was published on September 17th, 1796, the 9th anniversary of the completion of the Constitution. Washington warned of the propensity of demagogues to exploit factions or interests for their own self-interest. Quote, cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust domination, end quote. These passionate attachments, as Washington put it, were an element of politics, of political life, but they were inappropriate as much as they might be a fact of life in the interactions between individuals. In other words, he understands in a way the fallen nature of men and women, but it's the job of statesmen to try to resist these passions and to enforce this obedience to the rule of law. One element of Washington's presidency that I wish modern presidents would faithfully observe rests on this idea, Washington's understanding of the role of the president as head of state or chief of state. The President of the United States is on par, in a sense, with a monarch, with Queen Elizabeth. He is the head of state. We, unfortunately, I think, particularly beginning in the 20th century, have downplayed that aspect of the presidency and elevated the president's role as a partisan leader and as a policy formulator. And I think that's unfortunate. For Washington, again, the idea that the chief of state was to be the personification, in a sense, of the nation, particularly as it deals with the rest of the world. Now, this view of the presidency was shared by most members of Congress at the time, who understood that the presidency, when occupied by George Washington, would epitomize the American government both at home and abroad. So Washington utilized this chief of state or this head of state role more effectively, I would argue, than any of his successors. Now, part of this can be attributed to the Herculean task he confronted in terms of unifying a new nation and building respect for the presidency. Arguably, he succeeded so well that his successors did not have to take this particular task seriously, but they should. You know, particularly in times when the nation is divided, perhaps in 2018. As historian Forrest McDonald has eloquently noted, Washington endowed the presidency with the capacity and the awesome responsibility to serve as the symbol of the nation, of what it is and what it can aspire to be. Now, there is another aspect of Washington's presidency that I think we can learn from, in that George Washington was the antithesis of modern chief executives with his aversion to direct appeals to the people. These types of direct appeals to the people were, in Washington's view, demagoguery in nature. They were demagogic in nature and entirely inappropriate for a constitutional republic. Washington believed that his authority as president derived from the Constitution, not, in a sense, from the people. The people had ratified that Constitution, but his relationship to the people was through the Constitution. So, in a sense, it was an indirect relationship with the people. Washington was aware that he would be setting many precedents, as I said, and he was devoted to ensuring that those precedents were rooted in the Constitution. And again, unfortunately, in my view, I think we've lost that sense. So Washington had created an office of sober expectations that I believe, as modern Americans, offers a model for all of us to emulate. The office that he inhabited possessed enough power to defend the nation from foreign and domestic threats, and in fact, I would argue that Washington, with help from Hamilton especially, launched the United States on the path to becoming a superpower. But Washington's presidency also acknowledged certain restraints and limitations on the office of the presidency. Washington served as best he could as a unifying head of state who was respectful of the dignity of his office, who refrained from stoking partisan divisions and refrained from becoming a captive to public opinion. And he always paid due regard to the Constitution. So Washington's model, I would argue, is still within our reach. I grant you it's a long shot at this point. But it would require this restoration of sort of Washington's model presidency would require a renewed appreciation for the limits of the office and the limits of politics, and a renewed focus on the importance of the Constitution and also on the importance of character. And I'll close with this sentence. The American people, in order for this to occur, would have to be weaned from the politics of passion and embrace the founders, particularly Washington's belief that for self-government to work, the citizenry must learn to govern themselves and to govern their own passions. Thank you.